Hey, reader, this is Centaur here, and we are once again on vacation. So you're not going to see my normal setup, which is great. I also realized that the video that I recorded last on this trip is actually going to air tomorrow when you see this. So this is me saying, as future Centaur, that previous Centaur had a really bad audio. So prepare for that tomorrow. I'm very sorry about it. It's all my mistake, but we moved indoors now to make this a little bit better. And today we're going to be starting a new series. It isn't going to be every Wednesday. It'll be every now and then, probably on Wednesdays. But one of these we're going to be talking about is an in defense of series. And this is where we take units, much like we did with the Middler Strategy Battle game with the Tell Me a Tale blog that my brothers and I have been doing for years, where we take a unit that is often passed over for other stuff, not because it's bad. It actually does have quite a bit of use. It's just that people don't think to take it, or people don't want to take it, or people don't see the reason to do it. And so we're going to be looking at that today, looking today at the Feld or field units, the Feldgendarmerie and the Feldjaegerkorps for the Germans. So to start off with, why don't people take this, right? Because I think this is a reasonable question to ask. And this is mostly to start off with just the fact that it's just likely that most people aren't going to realize that they should, or that it's necessary, right? And that's because if you imagine that you have that top block, which is all people who play the game, and obviously we don't have data on this, but if you can assume that there's that group, and then if we assume that like roughly about 60% of people probably own a German army, both because if you collect allies first, you probably want an access nation to go against it. And if you do that, then there's a very high chance that the army for the allies that you play can fight the Germans historically, because basically everybody except for Australia meets that criteria. And then out of that group of people, if you assume that most people are going to buy a starter army or a starter set, and they aren't going to add on little gribblies from other stuff in order to make a specific unit, or they're just going to build the unit that you would imagine comes with the starter set, then what's left is this tiny, tiny group of people that would consider running Feldgendarmerie units or Feldjägerkorps units, which is military police, effectively. And so you, for the purpose of this video, are here, right? Then you're in this tiny, tiny segment of people who might have it. But I'm encouraging that tiny segment of people to grow, because I think it does add an awful lot to a German army. So first of all, what are these people? So the Feldgendarmerie, if you look on the Armies of Germany book on page 33, you will find that these are units that go back way back, like into the 1800s, okay? And they serve as military police, okay? They have multiple duties, which are actually quite nicely represented in bolt action. They're designed for logistical support, so they make sure that things are arriving at the right time, and they make sure that things are being moved up toward the front, which is very important. You will also find that these are the people who help to make sure that people are not running back or retreating from the front and doing their job. And you'll also find that they are distinguished by these metal gorgets, which we'll find, okay, which is part of the reason why people refer to them as chain dogs. Okay, but the point here, of course, being that it's a distinction and a title, and we'll see this even more with the Feldjägerkorps. That these guys are responsible, and if they give you an order, you need to listen to them. Kind of think like a sheriff badge. It's kind of the best way to think about these. Okay, and so we have an inexperienced unit with the Feldgendarmerie. They start as small as 4, which is kind of nice, and get as high as 10, which is also nice. You end up with rifles to start with, but you can give them submachine guns. You can give them pistols, which is also really nice because you can reduce the cost of them even lower than they are if you just intend for these to be a support unit. You can give them motorcycles as long as you don't take them above 4. So just don't buy any extra dudes. So if you want something that's zippy and can keep up with your other units in order to keep them in the field, you can do that as well. And they do have access to defend the fatherland, which gives you some interesting options, right? Because you can't do much with that because Gebersjäger and I believe Fallschirmjäger, both of those require you to be veterans. But it means you can technically make them fanatics if you really want to with the Waffen SS option, right? Because that one doesn't require you to do veteran only. So it's interesting. I don't think I would personally do that because you're kind of losing a lot of the reason for taking them cheap. But hey, at least you have the option. That's kind of nice. And they have 3 special rules, which are really the reasons why you would run these, right? So in this case, the first is that you can make it so that vehicles specifically get to ignore the -1 penalty to come in from reserve as long as you have a Feldgendarmerie unit in reserve at the time, right? So if they are off the table, then other vehicles that you have off the table can move onto the table without a penalty, which is rather nice. It also means you can really take advantage of taking like inexperienced transports and bring those in, especially if they have a platoon commander inside, because they will be quite likely to actually come on, which is awesome. They also get back in the fight, which effectively means you can re-roll failed rally attempts, which is niche because you don't always need to rally, but when you do, it is nice, especially if you're working with inexperienced or regular troops. It is nice to have a over 90% chance that you're going to pass, which is really sweet. So pretty useful. And then you have chain dogs, which is I think one of the primary reasons why you would look at taking these guys over and against the others, since the other two are pretty situational. You want these because any Straf Battalion penal squads or replacement army squads that you take, while they're within 6 inches of one of these units, they can ignore the shirker special rule. So you still got the cost reduction to take them in your army. You saved yourself quite a few points to take them shirkers. But as long as they're within 6 inches of your unit, they aren't suffering the penalty for being shirkers, which is awesome. So it's just free savings coming in. And the Feldjaegerkorps is very similar. These are veterans instead of inexperienced troops, so they are a good bit more expensive. They're also, by the way, only late war, whereas you get early, middle, late for the Feldgendarmerie. So if you are restricted by period, this is something to consider. They do get access to things like machine guns. They get access to up to 10 submachine guns instead of like 4 submachine guns. So that is nice. You can take assault rifles, still can take pistols. You can take a light machine gun. You can take a Panzerfaust, all of which is awesome. You can still take access to motorcycles as long as they're a small squad. You don't get access to defend the fatherland, which is kind of sad because it would be really nice to be able to give these guys something like Fieldcraft. That would be awesome. And if you could take Fieldcraft on a unit that had motorcycles, that would be awesome. Okay. But no dice. Can't do that one here. You get the same 3 special rules. Do note that the range for the get back in the fight now special rule is within 12 inches instead of being within 6 inches. So your rally is a lot wider in terms of what you're allowed to do. On the one hand, that is quite useful. On the other hand, it's still pretty situational, right? So there's that to consider. But in general, they all look really good. And so you can tell they're more in a support role, and you can build them for a support role thanks to being able to, reduce their cost with pistols. So that way, yeah, they won't be firing it very much, but that isn't really the purpose of taking these guys. Similarly with the Feldgendarmerie, but you're mostly taking these for these auric benefits. So why are they being overlooked if they have quite clear and quite obvious benefits? The first is that you get very limited light machine gun access in an army that really likes having light machine guns, right? So like if the Feldgendarmerie is an inexperienced unit, could take a light machine gun, that might actually be worthwhile because for the same cost as a machine gun team taken regular, you could take a 5-man inexperienced squad that has auric benefits that's firing not quite as many shots, but almost as many shots. Still firing 5 shots for like 50 points, which is not horrible in this game. You'll also find that this is a higher cost than other units for similar firepower. So, you can take a 4-man veteran squad with a bit of extra special rules, or you could take that 4-man, you could take a 5-man veteran squad that gets the same or better firepower for close to the same cost. And you could take 5 regulars that do have the same firepower with even better cost, right? So it's just tricky, right? Looking at it and trying to figure out if all you're looking for is shooting, right? If the auric benefits aren't necessary, then it's difficult to justify the expense. Similarly, they only really play well to specific army styles. So if you're not planning on keeping your vehicles in reserve, if you want them on the table as quickly as possible, you're paying for value that you're not really getting. Similarly, if you aren't using shirkers, then you aren't really getting much value out of the chain dog special rule. And if you aren't building units of infantry that are designed to soak enemy hits and thus soak pins and thus have to rally, then this also doesn't play into your style, right? If you're going for more of a multiple small unit style approach where firing at them a couple times is probably just going to remove the unit, but we have plenty of others and we were able to throw enough pins down range that maybe they aren't able to remove very many of us. If that's more your style, which ironically a 4-man inexperienced unit like the Feldgendarmerie actually kind of plays to, and Straf Battalion units kind of play to, if that's the case, then again you're paying for value that you aren't really getting, right? So it's just difficult sometimes. Some people are going to look at it and say, but I'm not using any of the things that these things benefit, so why would I run these, right? The other option is sometimes they're just not well known. right? And so you kind of get this out of sight, out of mind sort of thing where, people are reading through, they get to a lot more interesting stuff. And then, they get to this drop battalion and the penal units and they get to the field military police, and they're just not as interesting, right, as the Fallschirmjäger or the Grenadiers or Panzer Grenadiers, right, or things like that. So people just aren't thinking about making them, right? And so there's that. And then you also end up with modeling challenges, right? So if you're a newer hobbyist and you pick up a box of German infantry from Warlord Games, sculpting the gorgets is not going to be fun, right? Making the paddles is not going to be fun for guiding traffic, right? Um, Motorcycles can be very expensive, right? If you're trying to buy motorcycles. So I could see a lot of people looking at it and just saying, I just don't want to go through it all. It's a lot easier for me just to buy a box of men and throw them on the table, or to buy, an STL set of files for, traditional German style units, print those off and field those, right? It's an awful lot easier. So the result is I think these guys are going to be overlooked quite often. So looking at their offensive abilities, why would you take them? First of all, they do get access to assault weapons. If you want a squad that can really run in there and do some work, a Feldjaegerkorps unit can take 10 submachine guns. And there actually aren't very many German units that can take that many. I'm not necessarily sure you need to have 10, but if you really wanted to do a solid dropship of veteran infantry that can go in there and get the job done, and then you run other units up to help to support, and they are getting benefits of being able to reroll rallies and potentially ignore shirker rules for following up after these guys. That strategy can work and can work quite well. The veterans also get access to a light machine gun. They get access to a Panzerfaust. And so if you have a small Hanomag that only has, transport capacity of like 5, you could take a 5-man Panzerjägerkorps, Feldjägerkorps style unit with a Panzerfaust, and you could rush it up pretty quickly and deliver the Panzerfaust very efficiently, right? You could keep it at 4, and you could keep a platoon commander in there, and he could snap the two of them in the same turn, right? And admittedly, you need to have regular or veteran platoon commanders to take advantage of the extra human snap 2 benefit. But if you plan to just be snapping the tiny Hanomag and a 4-man squad, and then you get in order yourself, you don't technically need them to be regular veterans. So you could take that guy even inexperienced, and it works just fine for what you're designed to do here, right? You're to be honest though, you're really not purchasing these guys much for offense. That's not the reason why you take them. They have some capability, especially the veterans. But in general, my personal recommendation would be probably just take them with pistols and don't really worry about offense at all. From a defensive capability standpoint, the Feldgendarmerie option is inexperienced with 4 men, possibly cover. That is not good odds. Okay, defensively, this is not a good unit. It can be very easily removed. It could find itself in a lot of trouble, which could be really, really bad. Okay, for the veterans, you find that you have 4 men at veterancy, at veterancy, probably taking advantage of cover, which is pretty good actually. They are reasonably defensible. You're probably not going to lose more than 1 or 2 of them to a single round of shooting as long as the enemy's firing 10 shots or less. Okay. You also do get a benefit from being in reserve because you can help vehicles come in longer, which does help you out defensively with your resilience because you just have less chances of being shot, right? You cannot be hurt while you're not on the table. And so the result is it can extend the lifespan of this unit. Admittedly, you don't want to keep them in reserve for all that long because you're not getting the benefits to the shirker units, you're not getting the benefit to rally orders. So you don't want them to be out for too long. But if you plan to keep vehicles in reserve, if you're taking these guys, it's nice to always have one of them in there. So that unit will live a little bit longer. But honestly, that's also not really the reason why you're doing this, right? You're really doing this for the utility offense. You're doing this because you want more reliable vehicle arrival from reserve. You're doing this because you want more reliable rallies. This helps to keep your inexperienced and your regular units in the fight and following orders specifically a lot longer. You don't want them just going down, right? You want the unit actually doing something and moving the needle forward in order to move you closer to victory. Ignoring the shirker penalty is actually quite nice because if you can keep all of the shirkers close to these guys, then the chained dogs that are the Feldgendarmerie or the Feldjaegerkorps, they will keep your guys doing their job and even suffering pins an awful lot longer. It means that you don't need to perform order tests if they don't have pins on them in order for your shirker units to do what you want. It means that they're not doubling the number of pins effectively when you calculate both whether or not they've reached their morale value as well as when you're performing an order test. All of this is really good because it keeps everything going. Now, it means that you do have to keep them close, and this is where it gets tricky. Because, of course, if you start losing models in your Feldgendarmerie or Feldjaegerkorps units, the distance from the unit to your shirker units is increasing, right? It's going beyond 6 inches. So my personal opinion is you don't actually want them to be roughly 6 inches apart. I would recommend taking a Feldgendarmerie or Feldjaegerkorps unit and putting your other units roughly about like 3 to 4 inches away. Because if that's the case, you can afford to lose a man, possibly even two, and you'll still be within range. Similarly, make sure when you're doing setup that the most important units for your shirker unit, your officer, your non-commissioned officer, if for whatever reason on a shirker unit you're taking things like a light machine gun or some other piece of equipment, put those models closer to your military police so that way as you're suffering casualties, the most important stuff is still within 6 inches. Okay. This is the unfortunate part. And again, I think partially the reason why people don't tend to run these, they do require a little more work in order to really get the full benefit of the value that you have with these guys. But if you can make it happen, this can be very effective. But of course, the biggest benefit that you get with this is that you can pay less points for no downside, right? Requires you to do all of this, strategic thinking in terms of how you do deployment, and then a lot of tactical savviness in terms of how you activate them to make sure that you're staying within 6 inches when you might need them. But if you can do that, these guys can work out really, really well for you, and you can save quite a few points. So in terms of deployment considerations, consider holding one in reserve for vehicles if you plan to keep them there. Can be useful, not strictly necessary, okay, but can be useful. Second thing to think about is that you'll, again, want to deploy within 6 inches of your shirker units, okay, again, all standard stuff. Deploy in cover, or if you possibly can, deploy out of line of sight of the enemy entirely, okay? If you can deploy them right behind a ruin, if you can deploy them right behind a building or behind a really, really tall wall that will completely block you from line of sight, that is the jam. That is what you want, okay? And the simple reason for that is that you don't want these guys getting shot, especially if you're running the super cheap 28 points inexperienced with pistols Feldgendarmerie. You don't want that unit getting shot at, because not only are they more likely to fail an order test if they have pins, which means they may not be able to move up with the rest of your shirker units, and that can screw the whole strategy. But in addition to that, and critically, because it doesn't take that much for you to lose one or two models when you're wounding on a 3+, even if you have a 4+ cover save, even if you go down and you have a 2+ cover save, it is not unreasonable to roll 2 1s. Right. And the moment you start losing guys on this squad, not only are you minimizing the footprint of the squad, which is problematic for their auric benefits, but also, and more than that, if that unit suddenly disappears because they're removed, that's an order dice that was removed by your opponent, which could be victory points. That's going to really complicate things for your shirkers. It's going to cause a lot of problems, right? I mean, a lot of problems. You could suddenly find that you don't have people guarding an objective that should have been guarding an objective. You suddenly find that guys who you intended to clear an objective and then move on have to stay at that objective because the guys who were supposed to relieve them and claim the objective and retain it are not there. So realize going out of sight line of sight entirely is extremely useful. So highly recommend. Okay. Also, make sure that you have an avenue for movement. Okay? You want to make sure that you can get to a place where you can still support the shirker units everywhere you go. So make sure as you're planning out where you deploy them that you have a path that's going to make sure that you get to the place where you can help to support people on future turns, because just supporting them on turn 1 isn't going to be enough. So what's the overall value add? First and foremost, a 28-point inexperienced unit with pistols, with 4 men, that removes a bunch of the negatives from units that are each costing 2 points less than they otherwise would be, is a really good value add on its own, because it means you're just saving points, right? It also means that this is a cheap addition to any army that's going to be running these in mass, right? I mean, you're saving 10 to 20 points per squad, typically in each of these, with no downside as long as you can keep them close to military police, right? I mean, if you've got, say, call it two rifle sections, just so we can kind of show you what you can do with this. You could run, and you'll see this down below. You could pay 108 points for a regular platoon commander with a Feldgendarmerie unit and 2 Strafe battalions. The Feldgendarmerie unit has pistols. The Strafe battalions are just 5 men with rifles. You can run that for 108 points, which means you could run two platoons of these guys for 218 points. If you drop the platoon commanders down to inexperienced and give up the benefit of that extra snap 2, you can run these for 99 points each, as long as you don't buy an extra man. You can, and now you get access to 2 armor platoons, right? You get access to 2 artillery platoons for running multiple rocket launchers if that's your jam. You have a lot of stuff you can do now just by virtue of the fact that your rifle platoons are very cheap, and you still technically have a rifle squad left over in each of these. You could take more military police if you wanted to, just for sheer body count and maybe even for just redundancy, right? Making sure that, if you've got your penal battalion units over here, you can fill in the gaps in between each of those, offset a bit or whatever, with your Feldgendarmerie units, so that way you can keep them in the fight, right? It gives you a lot more room for whatever it is you want. If you really like running machine gun teams, you can fit heavy weapons platoons alongside whatever else you were thinking about. If your rifle platoon is really cheap, you could build out each of these rifle platoons as they are, as we note them below. And then for the fourth one, you don't have to go with an inexperienced squad. You could take a veteran squad with submachine guns of some way, shape, or form, and have push squads that go in Hanamag alongside all of these guys, right? You have the points because you saved yourself between all of these, like, what is that, 40 points between 2 rifle platoons, just by virtue of how you took the Strafe battalion, and you aren't actually suffering any negatives as long as the Feldgendarmerie units are still around, right? The other benefit too is that the auric benefits from these, unlike say the snap 2 benefit from officers, if you go down on a turn, that doesn't reduce your aura, it doesn't negate your abilities, you still get all of them, which is really nice. So you could just go down with the Feldgendarmerie unit every single turn if you just need to hold a position with these guys, and that will make them, especially if you're in cover, pretty defensible, right? If you're sitting on a 4+ save, becomes a 2+ save, you might lose a few guys, but you very well might not. So if you find that you're having trouble trying to cover your Strafe battalion units with the aura, while also staying completely out of line of sight, you could just throw them into cover and just say, hey, my plan is just to go down. That's the plan. The plan is just to hit the dirt every single turn and just tell everybody, keep fighting. That's my entire job. But the final reason, honestly, to pick it up, and again, I'm showing the War Games Atlantic kit that's over here on the far side. So you can buy these, by the way, as a plastic kit. You don't need to necessarily go the route of using green stuff or learning how to sculpt or things like that. Frankly, they just look awesome, right? Just being honest, like, they look awesome. And so because of that, you might consider just doing it because you're like, you know what, I love having a good hobby project. I want to do something that looks a little bit interesting and different and neat. And, if I'm being judged in a painting competition and I paint these up really, really well, if it comes down to, me and another person, especially another person with the German army, and our paint jobs are basically the same, people might look for the extra little gribblies, the extra little pieces, the bits and kit that you threw on. And if they see those, they might be like, well, that's kind of cool. That's interesting and different. I don't see that very often. And that might give you an edge in a painting competition. So, once again, you do still have to be good at painting. There's still that. And that's why I don't tend to do all that well inside the competition, which is fine. Learning, growing, which is good. But if you're just looking for a new, just hobby project, you just want something that's interesting and fun, may I recommend to you military police units? They're very interesting. They do have a role. You don't have to go out and buy 30 models in order to make these work. You buy 4, right? You don't need big squads of these. The bigger squad does mean you have a bigger footprint, which is nice. And of course, you have a bit more insurance in case you start losing dudes that you can still stick around, right? But you can take these super, super cheap. And I think that Feld units in general should be fielded more often. It plays into a specific strategy, but I think that strategy could work out really, really nicely for you. So what are your thoughts? Do you live in a place where people use these all the time? I've been looking through lists that people have been presenting at tournaments. I've been to only one tournament so far in 3rd edition. I have not seen these guys present, like, basically at all. I did one practice game against them with a friend of mine that I'm getting into bolt action. And they performed fine. They did a great job. It was very useful to be able to just ignore the shirker penalties. So, like I can say firsthand from experience, having had to fight it, that they do work. They're just, I think a lot of people just have impediments that make them not want to take them. And so that's what this series is all about. It's all about saying, I really do think there's some value here. Just consider giving it a try. If you have a couple models lying around from a sprue that you weren't planning on using, maybe consider mocking them up as Feldjaegerkorps. Maybe consider mocking them up as Feldgendarmerie units. And worst case scenario, you can always just say, well, those are just extra riflemen in my squad. I'm proxying them in as here grenadiers, right? Or whatever it is that you want to use. But let me know down below what you think about them, and I will see you next time.